And for a closer look at Brexit and its implications, political analyst David Kitching joins us via Skype from Ireland. So a lot to talk about here. David, in this letter to the EU, Theresa May acknowledged the challenge in reaching a comprehensive agreement in 2 years. Could they get it done in 2 years? Could it go longer? And what happens if that timeline isn't met?
Yes, indeed, Elaine. Good to talk to you. In theory, negotiations are allowed to be finished before 2 years, but the reason the limit was set on it is so that they don't drag on too much and slow the other processes of the European Union down. The real problem for Theresa May and for the UK more broadly will come after the 2 year period is over. Because while Richard mentioned earlier that she has asked for parallel negotiations on trade, there's really no incentive for other EU member states to allow this. And her real problem will come afterwards when the UK tries to engage in trade negotiations, both with the EU and with third partners.
So,
and if you look at how long it took for the EU to negotiate the CETA or TTIP agreements and all of the hurdles they faced along the way, the UK is really in a weak position in terms of negotiations.
So, David, when it comes to those issues, other than trade, what do you think will be the most difficult to reconcile and agree on?
I would say undoubtedly it would be the free movement of people. This emerged as such a big issue in the campaign itself, even in terms of polling that we had carried out beforehand. It was by far the largest issue among those who intended to vote for Brexit. The problem is that both the EU and the UK want to trade with each other, but with the four freedoms of the EU in terms of freedom of goods, services, workers, and capital, these are not. It's not possible to separate one from the other in terms of EU law. And again, these are in binding agreements and treaties that have been in place for decades. So it will not be possible for the EU or the UK to decouple these. And as a result, the UK will either have to accept a weaker position in terms of trade or a more conciliatory position in terms of immigration.
We know that Brexit is still very divisive to many in the UK, even in Europe. Do you think the passion for either side has lessened at all since that referendum last year?
It doesn't seem to have lessened. Now, there are some who have been slightly more reflective in hindsight when they maybe didn't realise the consequences of having voted to leave. And then maybe some who were opposed to Brexit who have accepted it as the new reality, as the new status quo. But overall, when the consequences become more readily apparent, and as we've seen in parallel, this resurgence of nationalism, and even a sort of a post-imperialist nostalgia, where people have been referring to the old days of the British Empire as a sort of international alternative to the European Union. It is possible to see a further polarization coming down the line.
What about everyday citizens, UK expats living across Europe? EU citizens' rights, you mentioned free movement across borders. What is the biggest concern among everyday people there?
Well, among the UK citizens living abroad, there's a particularly large cohort of retired British people living in Spain, for example, and other countries, Portugal, Ireland, and Italy. But when you're a citizen of an EU member state, you're entitled to the same healthcare treatment in another EU member state as you would get at home. As a result, elderly British people are receiving the highest quality of Spanish healthcare on the same arrangement as they would have on the National Health Service in the UK, which is universal and free. This could be taken from them, or the pension-based agreements that were struck up over many, many years. In addition to this, there are other issues with regard to extradition and the European arrest warrants, which could also be impacted quite heavily, and will have a broader effect on policing and other security matters.
All right, David Kitching, thank you so much for joining us from Ireland.
Thank you very much.